And I'll turn it over to you folks to carry the ball.
Well, thank you, Roger. My name is Corey Weitzel with HWC Engineering, and welcome to this presentation and open house discussion for the airport area strategic land use plan. Again, my name is Corey Weitzel with HWC Engineering. We'll let the panelists introduce themselves. Stephanie?
Sure, I'm Stephanie Ward with Mead & Hunt. I'm an aviation planner and was involved with the project of laying out some of the approach surfaces and airport operations areas.
Thanks, Sam.
Bill Fry, I'm the president of the Hamilton County Airport Authority.
Hi, I'm Sam Sachs. I'm the airport director here at Indy Exec Airport.
I'm Roger Kilmer. I'm one of the planners with the town of Zionsville, and I'll take this opportunity for all of the attendees as we go through tonight's meeting. If you have any questions that you would like to pose to the panelists, we would encourage you to submit those via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. At our last meeting, we kind of bounced back and forth between the chat feature and the Q&A, and it seemed to work better for those that were presented in the Q&A format. So again, attendees, for any questions you might have, please utilize the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Thank you.
Corey, I do see one question in the Q&A already. They wanted to know how many, asked if we could tell them how many participants are online right now.
We have a total of 42 attendees and 6 panelists for the meeting tonight.
Okay.
Well, let me go ahead and get started, and I'll share my screen so you can see what we've got. Some materials. Again, my name is Corey Weitzel, and I'm going to walk through a couple things tonight. First of all, just provide a brief overview as to what the purpose of this plan has been, what were the key questions, and some of the topics that we've been looking at as part of this. And then the other part is really this question and answer and taking comments on the plan. This is in draft form, and what we've shown to the public has been a brief presentation, a small executive type summary of the plan, and answered some key questions. What we're looking for tonight is really some input on that, really the land use map that's a key part of this planning effort. And certainly we'll stick around and answer questions as this comes up. So a few things to orient you to the plan. So the plan is actually a joint plan between the town of Zionsville and the Hamilton County Airport Authority. And it's to look at what is this area around the airport and how do we accomplish the goals for both entities? How do we accomplish goals for protecting the current and future use of the airport? How do we meet Zionsville's development goals? And how do we do that by achieving an appropriate mix of development that's compatible with the airport and the town's uses? So a couple of things just to start in with this, and I think we start with what would be happening at the airport in the future, both things that are happening now, but what's the long range view? And so there is a phase 1 runway extension. If you've seen any of the materials in the past, I think we said that was still in planning and working through, and this plan has taken a little time as we've been very patiently putting it together. And so now that runway extension is under construction, and that's to the south. The key thing about the runway extension to understand is that this is a project that's intended for safety. It is not increasing the capacity of the runway so that you could have bigger jets coming in. This is a safety factor for those who are already using the runway. There is a second phase of that is in the airport's master plan. And then long term, there's also a potential for a crosswind runway running east-west. Now, there's been a lot of conversation about the runway project and airport master planning concepts. And so if you have questions about this, I'm going to point you to 2 things tonight. The first one is there was a frequently asked questions issued, and you can get that if you go to the town's website under the Indianapolis Executive Airport Study. A copy of that frequently asked questions is available that you can review. And then there was an open house that was held earlier this fall, and there's about 2 hours of discussion that go through all the details of of that. So we're really not going to cover this tonight. And so we'll answer some basic questions, but for the most part, we would encourage you to really look at those materials for questions about the future of the airport. As it comes down to planning land use, which is the key topics that we wanted to cover tonight, it really comes down to this question of how do we find land uses that are compatible around an airport that also fit the town's development goals. So when we're thinking about airports, we want to be careful about things that are tall. We want to be careful about having a lot of density around development. We want to be sensitive to looking at where noise is going to be generated and how does development, how sensitive is development going to be to noise. We want to think about things that get in the way of airplanes like smoke or glare. And then we want to look at minimizing wildlife around them. So what that generally means is things that are less sensitive to noise, like commercial or light industrial, are very appropriate around an airport. Some of the more dense types of residential can work without getting too dense, but things like traditional single-family residential generally not as compatible with airport uses. Where this plan really comes together is in creating a future land use plan of what the uses around the airport would be. And this is really the heart of what we've been trying to work on. I'm going to orient you to this map so you can kind of understand what we're looking at to make sure that we see it. So this is 421 running just a little off of north-south. State Road 32 runs across the north side here. And then this is 200, and then 300 is down here. This area in blue is where the airport is right now. We'll look at this map a couple times. Recognize this is a draft and we're looking for input tonight from you and then following the meeting about your thoughts and ideas about what we're looking at here. So let's talk about a couple of things that came out pretty early in our conversations as we've explored ideas about land use in this area. I would also point out as we look at this, that this area around here, we've kind of only showing a portion of the town. These are areas that based on air traffic patterns and the heights the air traffic is flying at, these are the areas that have some sensitivity to the airport. So this is the extent of what we wanted to look at. This is certainly not the whole area on the north side of the town of Zionsville. One of the first things we looked at though was, let's break this down to smaller areas and look at what land use would be in each one. So west of Michigan Road, this is an area that has Eagle Creek flowing through it. There's a lot of floodplains, a lot of wetlands, a lot of tree cover. And really the driving development pattern here has been estate residential. And so this plan draft really recommends continuing that with a little bit more thought towards conservation of some of those key environmental features, the wooded areas that are in those areas. The other thing that got some consensus early on was areas north of State Road 32 really should stay as a agricultural use. There's still 2,900 acres up there, so a lot of land, but it seemed like development should be fully complete before it extends anywhere north of 32, and that's well into the future. So for the purposes of what we're looking at here, this generally says let's keep that area north of 32 as agricultural. The other thing that we have to look at is what are the areas that are most impacted by air travel. And so what you see on here is a couple of things. In these red boxes, you'll see those green areas. Those green areas represent the takeoff and landing areas. So north and south of the runway, you have the existing runway protection. And these are shown in green. The west and east are shown as the future crosswind runway. Again, that's a very long-term potential project. No activity is happening on that. What is really recommended in these areas is protecting that as open space. Now, some of this to the south, especially, has already been developed out. And so the recommendation here has been, let's just not change the density or the character of the development. So if it's single story, let's stay single story. If it's 2 stories, stay there, but let's not start making that much more dense, start adding apartments or towers or changes that would impact the airport. A couple of the more interesting recommendations of this is how do we fit some commercial in here and what's appropriate? And so we've looked at this intersection of 421 and 32 and said this is an area that has a lot of long-term potential to be an appropriate place for commercial. but traditional commercial with big boxes in the style of suburban development did not seem to fit the character here. So the plan really looks at this idea of what we've called an airport village, this idea of how can we create commercial space that takes advantage of its location next to this airport to create something kind of unique and special. This is envisioned as some offices, commercial, retail, hotels, and maybe some more that mixed density residential, things like upper story apartments over commercial spaces, more mixed use. Still, the character of this area is important, and in keeping with Zionsville's development patterns, we really modeled density of this as something after the village and thinking about how that could portray here, but be a little bit of a unique and different animal as well. One of the other things that we recognize is there is an appropriate place somewhere in this for employment sites. You know, where could we put a small light manufacturing or some type of businesses? And we looked at this idea of on the east side of the airport, there's about 600 acres there, and that could have direct access to the airport, as well as it could have indirect access. And that gives the opportunity for some pretty unique businesses, things like just-in-time manufacturing, not based on bulk goods, trying to send out a lot of materials, but things that are more time-sensitive manufacturing, things that need to be made and shipped in a very short period of time, technology, medical services, some of the things that are promoting more high-paying jobs and not things that are just warehousing opportunities. Some of the harder questions that we struggled with are, what do you do in these areas closest to the airport that, because of their proximity to residential and other spaces, really are not appropriate for commercial or industrial? And so these are areas that we've looked at as maintaining as open space, or looking at agriculture or agritourism types of uses that are mostly open space, that are not as sensitive to the noise conditions of being so close to the airport. This is challenging in a couple of ways. One of them is that there is sanitary sewer service up to available to extend up to County Road 200 South here. And so these areas between County Road 200 South and existing development, you know, have the potential to be developed in the short term, but there's some real drawbacks to developing those areas because it's proximity to the airport. This draft looks at saying these really should remain open space. So that's been a key challenge, and certainly an area that we're looking for input on. Now, once you get a little further from the airport, there are some opportunities to look at some type of residential. And so this idea of a mixed-use campus housing development has come out, and that's about 400 acres there, far enough from the airport that it's not as direct of sound impacts, but it's still close enough that there would be some noise associated with that. So it's not traditional single-family residential that would be appropriate here, not the suburban kind, but more of, we've called it a mixed density type of development, where maybe it's some attached housing, maybe it's you know, duplexes or quadplexes, still keeping it low story, low rise development, but mixing in some other uses such as office or commercial as well. So that's a kind of a overview of what's in the plan content. One of the key questions is, how do you implement it? So what does this look like? And it's important to recognize that this is a policy guide. This is there to help make decisions and to guide those decisions, but it's not ultimately a regulation. And the way regulation is done for something like this is to create an overlay district. Zionsville has several overlay districts, including the Michigan Road overlay. So this is not a foreign concept, but it's looking at this whole area and using that as an implementation tool. So that would be a next step to actually implement a plan like this. But as I said, we're looking for input. From a couple of names up here that you can send to for input, that's also available on the town website. And again, I would encourage folks to look at the Executive Airport Study page on the website for more information. So we've provided a lot of information already. There's been a whole detailed presentation that we did that was posted online to go over this in much more exhaustive detail. As I said, we're here tonight to answer questions. So what we would encourage you to do is, if you have questions, you can put those in the Q&A and we'll go through those. If it's something you would like to discuss, then we can, if you do a raise hand, we can also go through that and and bring you up and have you ask your questions. So Wayne, is there a best way to get the questions started? Just start going through them?
Yeah, I would say just start going through them.
All right, so the first question that we do have, it's what is the current zoning of the land north of the Brookhaven and Fieldstone neighborhoods? And doesn't the runway extension require rezoning this land in order to use the, for use? Sam, you want to answer that question?
Yeah, so the area just north of Brookhaven Fieldstone is actually zoned residential. This is going back a couple of decades now. It's been like that for a while. Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was zoned by Boone County many years ago. So that is one of the challenges we are facing, is that residential zoning immediately south of the airport. It does not require rezoning for the runway extension, though, because the extension is on our property. It isn't across 200 South. So the extension won't affect that land, but it doesn't affect the ability for homes to possibly be built there. Hopefully that answers your question.
Great, thank you. Second question that's on here is funding for the runway extension being provided by federal funds, and how much of that tax money is being provided?
This is another one I can take. So you are absolutely right. The runway extension is being funded via the FAA and their Airport Improvement Program, or AIP program. That's very common. Almost any public use airport across the country, when they have a large scale project, is going to be conducting that project through the AIP. That's very normal. We're actually doing a multi-phase approach for the runway extension. There isn't one single project that is covering the entire extension. The AIP program that is going on right now, which is the grading of the area south of the runway, is about $3 million or so for that one.
Great, thank you. We'll answer another one of these, and I see a hand up, and we'll work from there. So the question is, it does not appear that you've taken into account some of the homes along 1200 East and 200 South, and there are farms that have been there for years. And if that's proposed as light manufacturing, how does that impact those homes? Well, first of all, there's nothing in this that would change the right of people to continue to live where they've lived and do what they're doing. The question's always in land use planning is, if it changes, what should it change to? So uses that are there can continue as long as they would like, but as soon as land changes, what should it be? And what the plan like this is doing is saying, if it changes, it should change into more of that light manufacturing use. And by doing that, also discouraging a heavy duty residential or something else that would be not compatible with development. So those certainly are considered and thought through as part of this. I do have a question from Bruce, who's raised his hand. Bruce, I'm going to allow you to talk here and ask your question or provide your comment. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I guess I have a number of concerns here, but I'm going to start with Sam Sachs and Bill Fry. I would like you to address specifically. So, are you using is there a 5-year carryover on the AIP program, the Airport Improvement Program, where you can get a certain amount per year? And are you carrying the 5 years into this program? And also, from my limited reading, I understood that other airports can gift you portions of AIP funding for your project if they're not going to be using it. So can you answer those questions first?
You answer it, Sam, or you want to answer it?
Go for it, Bill.
Okay. There's no 5-year carryover on the AIP. Our projects are funded on a year-to-year basis. So every year we have to go before the FAA with the plans for the following year. They have, however, planned this out in their longer term planning. The entire project is planned out. So the FAA, in their own internal budgeting and planning, are planning for these projects to go on for a number of years, even though the money isn't made available except on a yearly basis. As far as other airports gifting their funds, I suppose it's not really the airports don't gift it. If the FAA decides that one airport has priority or another, they can shift the priority of their funding. But I've never heard of any gifting of one airport to another.
Bill, I could comment on that if you don't mind. He's right that airports can, if they're not going to use their $150,000, their non-primary entitlements, they have the ability to do that.
Yeah,
However, it doesn't happen very often because most airports have a pretty good need that they hold those funds. They can be rolled over in what they use the term multi-year, but all of your projects go well beyond just the entitlements that you're obviously looking for additional funds beyond that. So.
We should mention there's actually two types of funding. One is this discretionary that's about $150,000 a year, and then there are project-based fundings, which our airport runway was.
Okay, can you still hear me? Am I still
Yes,
on?
we can still hear you.
I have another question, and I wrote this in text, but I'll go ahead and say it verbally. I'm trying to understand how you guys can possibly be selling us that a 2,000 foot or 1,500 foot extension of the runway southward is not going to result in aircraft coming in at a lower altitude on their approach. Can you address this? Because I think a number of the homeowners in Brookhaven, we have approximately, Brookhaven and Fieldstone, we've got 350 homeowners. If you consider Union Township schools, you've got a vast greater number of people. We've got Union Elementary right next door here. Okay, so how can you expect us to be comfortable with a runway extension of 2,000 feet, almost half a mile, that's not going to result in these aircraft approaching at a lower altitude than they currently are?
I'll go ahead and jump in there. So I would encourage you to watch the presentation that we did a month ago about the runway extension. We had about a 2-hour-long presentation, answered over 50 questions, including that exact question that you had. So we're really trying to focus on the land use for this meeting. So I would really encourage you to look at that.
I have to interrupt you for a minute here, okay? All right, I feel that you're giving this shiny little object to the town council, treating them like a bunch of crows. Hey, we've got this shiny object of commercial development, but the real objective here is to get that runway extension. I think that's the real objective here.
There's no objective, Bruce. The runway extension is already occurring. So
it may be occurring, but you don't have rezoning, right? You don't have rezoning of the property north of Brookhaven. And in that instance, I find it hard to believe.
There's no reason to rezone that land. Our runway extension is not extending into Brookhaven.
I understand that. It's not extending into that property either.
Let me finish, please. The only thing that would extend into that area is that the second phase of the project, if we were to go the additional 700-foot extension, the runway protection zone would extend into Brookhaven, but not the runway itself.
And what is the runway protection zone, please?
Runway protection zone is an area at the end of a runway. And if you notice the chart that they had up earlier, there's kind of a trapezoidal area shown at the end of a runway. That's area that's protected from primarily height of any structures in that area that would be in the way of an aircraft either making a landing or takeoff from the runway.
So what is the maximum? What is the max or the minimum approach altitude of an airplane over a residential area?
Well, I mean, on an approach, it's until they get down to the ground. But in the area that we're talking about with Brookhaven and Fieldstone, yes, the extension of the runway will lower the approach altitude by about 80 feet. So it'll go from around 500 feet to about 400, well, 520 feet to another 400 and something feet.
I do want to jump in there too, Bill. The runway protection zone would not go into Brookhaven or Fieldstone. It would go into that zoned residential area
Right.
north of Brookhaven and
Right, that's-
Fieldstone.
Yeah, you're right.
But yeah, it would not extend that far south. All right, Corey.
I appreciate the questions on this because I think those are important ones, and there's extensive question and answer about this. What we really want to focus our conversation tonight for is to get us to questions about the land use on this. And I don't want to discourage any questions or concerns that you have, but I would encourage you to ask questions as they relate to land use so we can accommodate that within this plan. If there are questions about the runway, that project is already underway. Happy to take comments about future, but we really want to stay close to that. So I'm going to go to a couple of the questions that have been typed, and then just a couple more that have their hand up that we'll get to. So can you expand your definition of campus housing? Is this intended to target low income housing? And certainly campus housing is not intended to be low income housing. What campus style housing is, you often see it for more of a senior housing. You start to see it as just a way to create a little bit more density around housing, but still have something that's very compatible with a rural setting. So think of single story uses. It may be multiple units within a single story structure, but really trying to stay low rise with that. Sam, I think you had something maybe you wanted to add to that.
Oh no, you hit the nail on the head there, Corey.
Okay.
I might just add to that. We're often thinking about campus style as a little more clustered. Part of the goal in that area is to make sure that we do have some open space areas. So it might be a little more, as Corey used the term, compact. So it's a little, it's denser, but the area, the footprint is a little more compact with more open space around the edges.
Very much. It's a substitute of individual space in backyards for a group open space. And there's several places like that that are looked at. One of the questions that is on here was, when was the last updated? There are large residential areas to the south and southwest that are missing or planned. There certainly have been ongoing developments, and some of those may have happened over the last year or so since some of that was updated. So if you see something that is off, we will be updating all of this before it gets into final form, and we'll be going back through it to make sure that we have taken that into account. The next question is, I live north of 200 South in a red box. What happens to my home? Well, certainly nothing happens to your home unless you choose to participate in that happening to your home. This is a situation where when we do land use planning, again, we're saying if it changes, how do we make decisions about how it changes? So as long as you continue to live in your home, still used for residential, you're welcome to do that as long as you want. Nobody is changing that right. It becomes, if you want to sell it to an industrial developer, is that an appropriate use? Or if you want to sell it to, change it to a completely different use, what is appropriate and what's not in that area? So that's how we make that kind of determination. Next questions, is there a timeline for potentially transitioning the land use into an overlay? No timeline has been established, and the first priority is finding a land use plan that all are comfortable with. And then you would look at crafting an overlay district. Even then, it's important to recognize that this is a very long range plan. There's not a push to make this happen in a short term over a handful of years. This is a long range effort. And for the most part, everything north of 200 does not have sanitary sewer right now. And it's actually in a different sanitary sewer district. There is no infrastructure in the district north of 200. So the likelihood of any type of short-term development is pretty minimal. And so we recognize that it's going to take a lot of time for those areas north of 200. And areas south of 200 have short-term potential, but they're in kind of this area where there's some real questions as to how do you make those decisions in that area. So I think we've covered that one. What analysis have been done to assess impact to the elementary school, to the neighborhoods, and on property values within these neighborhoods? I don't know, Seam or Bill, do you want to maybe kind of talk a little bit about the elementary school? I know you guys have had some conversations about that as part of this.
Well, my comment is that's been very well covered in the webinar that we did on the runway extension. I will say that at the time the Union Elementary School was planned for that area, the airport opposed it very vigorously, and even proposed a different plot of land for that school. So it was put in over our objections to it being there. So as far as the Union Elementary School, when it was built, it was put in with additional soundproofing and so forth to accommodate being in a noise sensitive area, which most of the homes in Brookhaven and Fieldstone and parts of the Willows are in what's termed a noise sensitive area as defined by the state of Indiana. And that's any area that's 1,500 feet either side of a center line and 1 nautical mile south of an airport property. As part of that law, any residents or any structures built there need to be permitted by the state of Indiana to be built in a noise sensitive area and have to have included in their documents, closing documents, a statement to the fact that the residence is in a noise sensitive area and is subject to aircraft noise.
And so as we talk about impacts to property values associated with that, certainly the airport was there before those homes were built. And that is not necessarily changing that's not impacting property values even more than it was based on when it was built. The question becomes if the airport dramatically changes its use or intensity. And I think it's important to note that there's no plans here to dramatically make changes in the type of planes that are coming in. This kind of fits into the next question that was on here, which is, are there changes to the airspace around the airport, control tower, or the weight limit of the runways changing? I don't know, Stephanie, maybe you can help answer that question.
Sure. The airspace itself is obviously going to extend just a little bit with the runway extension, but we've taken that into account with the land use plan in terms of mapping that. As Corey mentioned with the graphic that he showed, the area that we're looking at, we really spent a lot of time refining that so that we've taken into account the approach and departure surfaces, what the predominant runway use is, and also where the traffic patterns are. So, we have a lot of flight training that happens at the airport. And so they've got a different type of approach and departure in and out of the airport compared to the corporate activity. So in the grand scheme of things, there'll be some minor changes to it with the runway extension when it happens, but we're not changing anything beyond that. And there's no plans for a control tower. The amount of activity that takes place at the airport today would not warrant a control tower. Sam, I don't know if you want to comment. I mean, the weight bearing capacity, we've talked about that at the last meeting, that's really not changing either.
Correct. Yeah, you hit it all, Stephanie. There's absolutely no plans for a control tower. It's just something that's never been pushed for. And then we're not changing the weight bearing capacity of the runway. That would require a complete rebuild of the runway from the ground up. And that is not what we're doing. We're just extending what we currently have. So it won't be any stronger than it currently is.
Thank you. Let's take a question from folks that have their hand up. I've got Craig. Craig, I'm going to hit allow you to talk, and then if you hit unmute, you can speak. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you very much. I had written a question. I'm one that lives north of 200 South, and I moved out here because it's quiet, small, little. Did I know the airport was there? Absolutely. Not a problem with it. I enjoy airplanes, but I also enjoy peace and quiet. One of my largest fears is that we become a Plainfield or a Whitestown, and we take our small town, and all of a sudden we become industrialized commercial when we really are a small rural area. And that's what our background has been. And so I just really, really, really need some sort of reassurance that we're not going to become a industrial park with warehouses, manufacturing, noise, larger planes, and becoming a microcosm of honestly what I think are unattractive towns like Plainfield and Whitestown.
Well, and that's why we're taking input tonight, is to hear, what the community wants in this area. And I think that those are good descriptions that we can rely on, because that's a lot of what I've heard as well, Craig, as part of this process. Is there's a place for some commercial, there's a place for industrial, but this is not the place for giant boxes and Amazon warehouses. This is a place that needs to fit into its settings. When we looked at the commercial district around this airport village idea, it was very much, how can we follow something that mimics what's already been done in the village, not more dense than that. Very much trying to say, how do we do things that fit into the character? We've taken areas, especially west of 421, and identified those as remaining very much the same character. But recognize there is a place where there is some limited development around the airport, and there are places where development is appropriate and places where it is not. So I appreciate the comments on that. I have Jane. I'm going to allow you to, Jane, if you hit unmute, you can provide your comments. Welcome.
Thanks. It's actually John.
Uh-oh, it's
No, it's fine, Jane.
Sorry about that.
No, it's good. So here my question revolves around, and we've kind of danced around it a couple times, is the light industrial aspect. So the neighborhood that is zoned for commercial or for housing just north of Brookstone and Fairhaven, what would it take, or how could you change that zoning into light industrial, which would affect our property values, because we didn't buy so that we back up to a light industrial? Does that make sense? Is that a fair question?
Your question is, could the land north of Brookhaven Fieldstone be rezoned to light industrial?
Right, because you had mentioned that's what you guys would like.
Well, what was proposed as light industrial as part of this were areas east of the airport, so not south of 200.
So that will just stay commercial, not commercial, housing, single house.
What was proposed in the area between Brookhaven Fieldstone and 200 was to remain as open space, to be agriculture, agritourism, and open spaces. Certainly some of that area is currently zoned for residential, and this is one of the issues we're looking for input on is it appropriate to develop residential that close to the airport? Or, certainly you're providing input. You do not want to see industrial areas north of Brookhaven Fieldstone and south of 200, which is not something that's recommended as part of this.
Okay. And so the second half of that question, which my wife had typed in, was what does the town of Zionsville, where's their input, and what do they think about this plan that impacts single family homeowners?
Wayne or Roger, do you want to speak to that?
Certainly, I'm happy. Sorry, a little glitch there. No, the town is a partner in this effort and is certainly interested in seeking the input that we're working to hear this evening. So this is part of the exercise. This is a very open conversation.
So the town is good with light industrial. I know the extension is going to happen. It's, I guess we're worried about the next extension. I know the final approach is roughly 100 feet below, which in Fieldstone and Brookstone sometimes brings them really low. So from a Zionsville standpoint, even though this is not Zionsville's airport, we gave it away years ago. How do you protect the taxpayers of Zionsville versus an airport owned and operated by Hamilton County?
The land use changes that would be caused by legislative action by the town council would I think help answer some of those questions. I mean, this is a land use plan, an effort to study the area surrounding the airport. Certainly we've identified that there's an opportunity for some level of industrial that's clean, smart, tech savvy, and focused on providing for very specific uses that are tied specifically to airport centric type operations. How that all fits in is through your the overlay conversation, which would be a subsequent piece of this. So from a support point of view, yes, we believe that there's opportunities here, and part of this effort is to study that and have that conversation to see what the community thinks about these ideas.
Okay. I thank you for answering that, and thanks for taking my question. I would find it hard to believe that anybody in the Zionsville community would want light industrial or industrial in our rural community. Somebody else had mentioned that earlier. That's why we moved over to Zionsville, was because of this, because it's still a small village type town, even out here outside of the quote village. So thanks.
Thank you for your input. I have a comment from Beth. So Beth, I'm going to bring you up if you turn your mute off. Hello, Beth.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Okay. I had posted a comment. I'm the one that was concerned about not taking into account the current land use of estate farms near 200 South and 1200 East. I know 200 shows on your proposed zoning as a dividing line. Right now, and you said that there would be, that we'd leave our homes the way it is, but the way you're presenting this is there would be light industry in our backyard, and me and my neighbors who have horse farms or other type of estate farms don't want that right in our backyard. 20 years ago, we fought, this was before the town of Zionsville had annexed this area. The county had proposed changing the zoning to industrial, and we successfully overturned this. This was before Hamilton County purchased the airport. We've been there for a long time. The airport used to be just a small sort of hobby airport, and it has grown since we've lived there. And now there has been a lot more development south of 200, and having that kind of zoning close to 200, I can understand the 32 corridor, or on 32, that's the main highway. But I feel like you're completely overlooking what that area is right now. And we moved there because we want that type of atmosphere.
Well, this is exactly the comments that we're looking for. We need to understand all of this, and we really appreciate you providing that input tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I have, I think, another comment from Bruce. So I'm gonna, Bruce, you are on.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We've heard, if I'm understanding correctly, you want to locate industries that will be mutually benefited by a close proximity to the airport. Could you give us specifics as to what industries you are particularly targeting, or are there businesses that you've already identified that are interested in locating where they have a need for immediate access to an airport?
It's a good question. And so what we've looked at is very much a long range plan. So this is not a use plan that is targeting a very specific industry, but it's intended to give some flexibility. So the type of things that we are seeing this type of regional airport look at are very much just-in-time manufacturing things. So what we know is 60 to 70% of the value of goods are shipped by air. And so when you look at technology, especially small technology, when you look at medical equipment manufacturing or medical devices, so much of this is time sensitive, and a smaller operations, not big industrial facilities, but smaller niche businesses have the opportunity to do just-in-time manufacturing and delivery from an airport where you're shipping out small boxes of stuff, not, crates and crates and crates and cargo boxes, but small quantities. These are the type of things that make a lot of sense. There's also places for facilities that need, like Beck's, that are out there that have hangar space, that need a little office space, that need that airside access. And some of that can occur on the west side where it's already there. And then when we look at the east side of the airport, we look at some of those same opportunities, those type of businesses that are air travel intensive. And maybe it's just a manufacturing that's doing that. So we're seeing a lot of that as the opportunity. This is something that the town has to be very picky about. This is not saying, well, we put it out here for these uses to accept for an airport, and now we'll just take anything just to get development. That's kind of the risk here. Is we definitely want to look at things that are niche and supportive of this, not just general, any kind of industrial. I don't know, Stephanie, what else are you seeing in the industry that airports like this are pursuing?
You've captured a lot of it. I mean, I think some of the items that we've got are much closer to the tech, even maybe office spacing and those types of things where we've got medical suppliers, medical testing that's taking place that needs to be flown in and out. It's the type of thing that, it certainly isn't heavy manufacturing. It's not this types of things with smokestacks and a lot of noise generation. Those are the types of things that to some degree are not compatible with airports themselves, because of smoke or steam and those types of things. So, it's a very specific niche. And I think what we've heard through our conversations to date is that, there isn't anybody knocking down the door saying, hey, we've got to be next to the airport today. We're just trying to be responsive and think big or long term, what could some of those opportunities be for the airport and how do we preserve for that should the need arise and the opportunity exist. So
Stephanie, I would also think that some of the things that we're seeing probably fit just as much into a tech park or a research park as they would into an industrial.
Exactly.
This is not the place for the type of development that's occurring in Whitestown. This is not the type of development that's occurring in Plainfield. These are technology businesses that would be more appropriate in a Purdue Research Park or something else. Probably look from the outside more like office space, but have that little bit of difference. So maybe the terminology we're using is not helping here, and we need to think more of as a technology park that is looking at biotech as well as other
R&D, right?
Types of R&D that do have a bonus.
May I follow up on that just a moment?
Yes.
I'm retired now, but I've worked in the biotech industry for almost 3 decades. Okay. I am not aware of any technology that's so sensitive that it couldn't be driven 5 or 10 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour or two, okay, to an airport and shipped out. Okay. Because if it can't be driven to its destination and then flown, okay, it's not going to survive being implanted in a human or whatever. Okay. So I think when you guys throw out biotech, okay, which I specifically heard you just mention, I was kind of waiting for you to do that. I think you're kind of like, there's a little bit of misleading here because that technology is so far in the future. I can't imagine even if the technology to like regenerate an organ, okay, if that organ can't survive a flight in a cooler, okay, it ain't going to survive being put in a human. Okay. And then I want to tie this in with my question that's also in the Q&A portion is why should Boone County or Zionsville invest in the infrastructure for this site when we've already invested considerable dollars into the infrastructure for Creekside Park, and we're struggling to fill that. We luckily got Ray Hall Letterman, but we're struggling to fill that. And certainly as a biotech person, okay, I would certainly maintain that you could drive 15 minutes up to the airport to make your thing. So I really question what is being presented as this futuristic symbiosis between the airport and high-tech industry. It's not needed. And as we've seen with some of these businesses, you know, they'll go wherever they get the best tip, the best TIF funding or whatever, the tax breaks. They'll just up and move. So I'm just not buying it. That it's going to be the high tech development that you're going to get there. So when you mention medical devices and biotech, frankly and sadly, we are not an epicenter for those types of technologies. And I question, you know, how many centuries it's going to be before we would be. So I think we're kind of like, again, we're misleading people by saying that this is really needed, because it's really not, in my opinion. And the other question is, can you address specifically why we should invest here when in infrastructure costs, when we haven't even built out Creekside? So I'll leave it at that and lower my hand. Thanks.
All right, thank you. I think you've got a couple of great points. And certainly we don't know what the technology in the future is exactly going to be, how it's going to be done. What this is a land use plan. So we're not saying this is exactly what's going to be there. What we're trying to do is create a framework that looks well into the future and tries to identify how do we want to allocate land so we can take advantage of all these opportunities. Creekside is only so big, and at some point it's going to be full, and you're going to need other sites. And where are those going to be? What Zionsville offers that so many other communities don't is you are a place where there is talent, there is workforce here, and it's a desirable workforce. And businesses follow where there is workforce. And you want to make sure you have opportunities. Now, it's still residential development focus is a very good economic development strategy, but this provides some flexibility in your tax base if you look at that. This is not advocating that Zionsville be the one that develops this out. This is a plan that says how should land be used. Decisions about who develops it are far into the future and well beyond the scope of what we're looking at. So we're not going to come out here and make the case that this is the best fiscal place for the town to invest its dollars, because that's not the point of this effort. The point is to reserve land for the highest and best use for the community. And if it's industrial in this vein, great, but there are other uses too. And that's why we're looking for input on what is the best use in those areas. So thank you so much for your question. I'm gonna try to answer a few more questions that were in the chat, because we have several that we've not got through. So appreciate everybody's patience as we ask questions and try to answer this. So what are the steps in this process from current zoning to future changes? So right now, this is a policy document. It's there to help guide decision-making. The next steps in this is that would be the recommendation would be to look at a overlay district to implement some of the recommendations. And that would start to dictate more use towards height restrictions and use restrictions around the airport. It can get into a little bit more on very specific land use decisions as well. Those are the next steps, but it really comes down to what do individual property owners or developers want to do with that land. And that's where this really gets implemented. The overlay district would guide some of those decisions, but it really comes down to how people want to develop, how do they want to sell it, and those become the next steps. But the overlay district is really the next step in this process. By discouraging development of the area south of the airport, does that mean that infrastructure development will also be discouraged? That's a really good question, and this plan hasn't really spoke to that so far. You know, there are places south of the airport, especially south and west of the airport, where development would be appropriate for what the land use map has shown. But whether or not those areas immediately north, that's ultimately it's in a private utilities district, and that's not the town's or the airport authority's decision at this point. Time frame for implementing this plan. How would land be acquired? And and by who in the proposed areas. This is not a development proposal. This is a long-term guide for decision-making related to land. So this is long-term, meaning most of the areas north, especially north of 200, are looking out 5, 10, 20 plus years before some of those areas would develop. There is sewer south of 200, so there's potential for that to develop a little sooner. If any land is acquired, that's going to be transactions between private industries. There's not been any proposals for public acquisition of land that are part of this planning process. Is your intention to drive out residents who have home and properties located in the employer site district? No. As long as people want to continue to farm, continue to own that, this does not change how you continue to use that property. So those are not intended to change. What we do see though is change happens over time, and it's slow, and it does not happen quick. And sometimes it's over years, and sometimes it's over decades that the land use changes. And we just want to make sure there's a plan in place that if it changes, what does it change to? And we want to manage that. And we're looking for input on what those changes would be. Question pointing towards Wayne, what does the town think about this plan? I think we answered this already. And then the next one is also kind of pointed towards Wayne. So Wayne, I don't know if you want to answer that, which is, what are the town's development goals here? I guess I would point out as Wayne unmutes that we said right from the beginning that this is to find compatible development that works with both what the airport is looking for in terms of protecting the integrity and use of this airport, which is important to the region, including Zionsville, as well as trying to find things that meet the town's development goals. So Wayne?
Well, I think that's the essence of the effort here, is to identify what the town's goals are, and gleaming from these public conversations, how that should look, and how those are articulated in the form of zoning. Certainly striking a balance, recognizing that the airport is expanding, and how does the town both protect itself and maximize that relationship, at the same time counterbalancing that with what the view shed of everybody is in that conversation. It's complex, and that's part of the effort is right now here to determine what those goals look like.
Thanks, Wayne. Next question is about, will the airport be implementing any sound mitigation measures to protect adjacent developments from noise pollution? Stephanie or Sam, when you guys want to answer that?
Yeah, I can jump in. That is something that we also discussed with the runway extension presentation and FAQ. So I would encourage you to take a look at that and read up on some of the answers that we provided there. But there are no proposed specific mitigation measures that we have following the runway extension. That's the bottom line of that.
Thank you. Doesn't the PUD for Holiday Farms call for commercial and apartments and mixed use? This was shown as a state residential. You are correct. The Holiday Farms does have a mix of commercial and apartments and mixed use, especially on closer to Michigan Road. I think as we get north of 32, we really saw that as staying mostly residential west of Michigan Road. So that may be an area we need to clarify, since that development has been moving forward. So I think that's a good catch that we can address in the document. How can the property be rezoned to light industrial? I think we answered this. That is not proposed for the property just north of Brookhaven or Brookstone. I'm going to get these confused. The airport in Scottsdale, Arizona has businesses on both sides of the runway. Do you see Indianapolis Executive following this model? Really what we've looked at here has not been to look at it in a lot of businesses on both sides, with the exception of the areas that are already touching the airport to kind of the northwest as that approaches the airport village. We still see that as a pretty clear line between those. I don't know, Stephanie, is there anything else you would add to that?
The comparison of the two, I would almost argue are night and day different. There's a completely different market segment that uses the Scottsdale facility compared to what we would see here at Indy Exec. So I don't think they're really comparable. And certainly what we're proposing is not to have that sort of development on both sides of the airport. We're hoping to have airport related development, and that's what's been identified right now to the west side that would have that direct access, and that area we've just been talking about there to the east side is certainly not heavy aviation based is the plan.
Thank you. The next question is, the approach will be about 100-foot lower on extension. I think Bill mentioned earlier it's about 80 feet, but that's in the same ballpark, so correct. Next one is, if sanitary sewer to be extended down State Road 32, would that change the proposed land use plan? We actually envision that the most likely scenario for sanitary sewer development in this area is probably sanitary sewer being extended from existing systems that are in Westfield pushing west towards this area. So what you're describing as sewer extending west along 32 is probably the most likely development scenario, even though there's a lot of different ways that could fall, and sewer is going to drive development. The challenge that we come into is in sewer comes in on 32, it kind of would mean that development would start north and head south. We see it very much the same plan, and we've tried to create this plan as it would work regardless of where sewer comes from. But if it comes from the north, it kind of follows somewhat contrary to where current development policies for the town have been. The town really has encouraged radial development from the village outward and try to do that in an orderly way that avoids leapfrog development. So if all of a sudden you're jumping from south of 200 all the way to the airport with development, that doesn't really follow the policy. But because it's such a priority to get sewer to the airport because of the opportunity that could create, this is a case where we think that makes a lot of sense, that you develop there and then develop at the airport and then develop from the south until they meet in the middle. And so it's more of a kind of a dumbbell approach of growing from both ends towards the middle in those areas, but it really does not change the layout plan that has been proposed. I'm going to go back to some of the questions that are been answered over here. So I've got a question from Beth. I have you up. Beth, if you would unmute yourself.
Me? I don't know if there's another Beth because I just typed in a question and then you're
Okay.
so I don't know if it's me or not, but I did.
It is you. Hi,
Okay.
Beth.
I just wanted to know, I had asked a previous question. Will the town of Zionsville take into account that the county proposed to rezone that area north, I put south in my question, of 220 years ago, and it was heavily opposed and was defeated. And also something that the town of Zionsville is known for is the friendly walking and biking and riding your horses. And there's a lot of people that cycle. I know people know me because I'm always walking my dogs, and these roads are narrow and it can't really fit industrial traffic. And that's why we moved out there. We want a place that's quiet, especially in COVID, to be able to walk without a lot of people, lots of cycling. Like I said, people are riding their horses, and it really changes the whole nature of the area to rezone that industrial. Again, this is 2 miles south of 32. It's not right on a highway. Anyway, that was my question, and just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. Did you get all that?
I did.
Okay.
We
I
are
didn't-
aware.
So I wanted to make sure that you heard me. Okay.
I'm writing down a couple notes at the time.
Oh, okay.
Because I don't want to forget these, because all these things are important. And yes, we were aware that there was a proposal for land use changes previously. That's something I had heard since the first kind of executive summary was put out, that was brought up. So I was not aware of that when some of this initially was put together. We've heard that since. And we want to take that into consideration. And that's why I've kind of asked a couple of these follow-up questions on the industrial uses out there.
It was heavily opposed. There was a lawsuit involved. There were the meetings were standing room only. It wasn't, and this was before all the development. This was before Brookhaven. This was before Union Elementary was there. So in my mind, by building those subdivisions in the school, they were continuing to use the land that around where my neighbors and I live, where we have our horse farms and everything, in more of a residential manner, which we supported. And now all of a sudden, we're kind of getting that, and there's so much more density and so much more residential in that area.
Certainly understand the questions and concerns, and it will be taken into consideration as part of this. And we've heard this a couple times tonight. So thank you very much for providing that. And we certainly understand the quality of life that folks are looking for, and walking and cycling are important to me personally.
And riding horses on that road, you can't.
And riding horses on the road. There you go.
When I first moved in, I rode my horse on 146th Street, which I would never do now, but to think about. That's why we moved out there.
146th Street is not equestrian suitable right now.
And it's actually not bike supported either. So a lot of the cyclists were a main artery on
Sure.
200, and it's an asset to live out there. It's like we're on the main bike routes, and it's nice.
Beth, thank you so much for your comment. We will take that into account.
Thank you.
I have a comment from Tyson. I'm going to put you up, and
all right, can you hear me okay now?
I sure can.
All right, great. Well, first, thanks for the time this evening from everyone. Certainly appreciate it. I've got a few comments and then a question. First, comment. So we live in the Brookhaven neighborhood, so I can say I'm fully supportive of the idea and intent of limiting home construction south of the airport runway. Obviously, as you've heard tonight, there's a lot of sensitivity with the existing residential neighborhoods and the school south of the airport today. So allowing further residential construction south of the airport would, only cause further issues for the airport and the town. The air traffic for residential neighborhoods south of the runway is already a major issue. So planning and zoning really needs to ensure that this doesn't get worse. So again, I've noted that is a part of the plan, and I think that's an outstanding idea. The other piece, again, hopefully another theme that's been kind of obvious this evening, I would also kind of echo that I have concerns about industrial use tied to the airport that would potentially drive a substantial increase in air traffic and industrial business in the area. I can also echo Bruce's prior comments. I also have worked in medical devices and the biomedical industry, and I can also say that, I'm not aware of any kind of special cause or instances where, a 15-minute drive on the road is such a burden that would require any business to be so closely located to an airport. So I would say, I understand the intent of the airport, and it's a business and trying to, drive utilization. But the challenge is obviously with the location of the airport near so many residential areas, there's certainly reluctance to have aggressive growth, both of industry and businesses, and then also air traffic in the area. So I'd say that's certainly something I'm not supportive of. And the last comment, it's actually a question directed to Wayne, I believe. Obviously, with some of what's proposed, the question is, are there any plans to address the increased traffic along 421 or Michigan Road? There's already been substantial growth in traffic on Michigan Road, and this planned land usage would obviously increase the traffic in the area. So are there any, what are the plans of the town to address traffic along the area?
Well, certainly with the state highway, the Indiana Department of Transportation would manage that asset. And so they would be making those decisions. Certainly, like you're touching upon, different entities are making decisions that will influence the reactions of others, such as the airport and their actions with the extension of the runway. The town's looking to react to that. Indiana Department of Transportation would be reacting to land use changes and making the roads more robust to accommodate those types of changes. With Zionsville itself, we do not have road infrastructure that is in our inventory. The roads in this area are under the jurisdiction of either Boone County or the Indiana Department of Transportation.
Thanks, Wayne. Tyson, thank you for your comments. We really appreciate that. I've got Emily Emerson. I'm going to bring you up. Hello, Emily.
Hi there. I'm going to have to speak quickly because I have two small children. I know future Union Elementary students who are not here. Be quiet. First, a comment is that if you cause reduction in property value that more or less forces someone out, it's somewhat disingenuous to say you can keep your house, you can keep your farm, etc. So just a comment on that. Moreover, I do have to say that, you know, kind of the more or less dismissive comment that Union was constructed over the airport's objections is not exactly reassuring, to people who have children who either are or will be attending Union, and people who care about Zionsville's reputation for having some of the best schools in the state, if not the best schools in the state. Yes, in Brookhaven, we signed an acknowledgement regarding the airport's presence, but, you know, this also doesn't mean that our neighborhood and the elementary school basically become fair game to have, you know, property values drastically erode in what's, you know, a good neighborhood and an outstanding school due to if there is going to be a substantial increase in air traffic and lower planes that already roar overhead, and if there really are going to be, you know, 80 feet closer to us, it's going to be even louder. I think, you know, Wayne, I think there are a lot of people from Brookhaven or Fieldstone and probably surrounding neighborhoods who are on this call, and what we need is assurance that the town of Zionsville is taking the concerns of its existing taxpayers and children into account. I mean, that's, you know, we keep hearing during this meeting, well, the extension's happening, it's a done deal, we don't have to change anything, it's going to happen. I mean, but there has to be some, you know, this needs to be done in a rational way, in a way that tries to preserve property values, particularly in established neighborhoods.
Emily, we really do appreciate your comments.
And I do want to say, I mean, this is the essence of the public engagement, is to capture these thoughts and quantify the entirety of the conversation. There are certain factors that are indeed established. What the airport is doing, what is federally funded, and other factors. But yes, this is part of that conversation, is to capture all of this data so this can be shared, discussed, vetted, and encapsulated in the study.
Thanks very much.
Certainly, thank you.
Thank you. I've got a question from Ken and Michelle Stark.
Yes, this is Michelle Stark.
Hi.
Hi. So, and Ken's here too. I'm speaking for both of us today. We are in one of those areas north of 200 in your red box. And to Beth's earlier notes, we were part of that activity that did occur with the lawsuits. My family was. I'm actually a second generation farm owner here in the area. And my background I've had a successful career in global manufacturing and logistics. So to Bruce's earlier notes, as he touched upon high tech and medical, I'll touch upon manufacturing and logistics, and just like it to be noted that it's absolutely not needed in this area. And as a second generation farm owner, and I do farm my land, I have had horses, we do cycle and ride on this road. I would like it to be noted that I do not support this transition to turning this beautiful piece of property into a commercial setting. I don't like the fact that I think it's very rude of you to think you can just change the zoning and we can live here as long as we want, but you've changed our long-term projection of what the intent of this property is. And if you go back and look at the time that we were zoned and that my property was segmented off of my parents' larger property for us to start our farm and have our family here, we were actually congratulated by the approval board at the time that this was the exact intended use for the property. And what an honor it is, and how it was a nice meeting to be able to do that and approve that for us, knowing what the future of this property could become. And I might add, has become. So I will tell you, with my background in manufacturing and logistics, where you currently have your corporate parks, where additional corporate parks could go along 65 in those areas and along 32, there is no need to have it on the airport property. If you are looking for a long-term use study, the long-term benefits of airports right now are looking at going to electronic planes, going to drones, going to that type of activity. Everything I've heard today, you talk about the property taxes and you talk about the noise. The best noise abatement would be to go electronic and not have the airplanes that we do today, because it's not the executive jets that cause the problem. It's the propeller planes that continue to circle over the homes. So I just want that known, that as a second generation farmer here, I do not support that. I think it would be wise of you to run a study to understand how many cyclists actually use this road, because we have cyclists that come from all areas of Carmel, Zionsville, Westfield, to use this road as a go-between that's safe.
We really do appreciate your comments, and that's why we're having this meeting. So thank you so much for providing that tonight.
Well, and to your earlier note, you talked about this is an avenue to capture thoughts and to quantify. I would just like to clarify that a little bit. What's going to be critical out of this is, what is your action? Beth has brought up how it was intended before and the fight that happened then. We are all ready to fight this again. And I think your action in the next couple months is what's going to be critical and what we'll all be watching for.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to try to get through a few more of the questions that are open here. And so we may have hit a few of these, but we'll try to jump back in. Is the development on the east side of the area, the employer spikes and projected to increase airport use significantly? I don't think there's any goal for anyone here to see just an increase in airport use in terms of the type of business that you're trying to attract to that, if you would. So much of it is looking at businesses that would take advantage of it, but this does not need to become a logistics airport. And that's very important to everyone that we've heard through this process. So the next question I have is, what is the plan for established residents where residential is not recommended, specific to 1100 East, north of 200? I think we've talked about that and received several different comments from many of those residents, just saying, let's try to keep this as open as we can and not looking at industrial is some of the things that we acknowledge that we've heard. So anybody that's in those areas where development is not recommended, we're not saying that changes. We're just saying we don't want to see that increase in intensity from an agricultural use, or in many of those areas, it's just very dispersed residential. And that is appropriate within this area and should be encouraged to remain. And that would be clear and as we work on a plan for this. There's a difference between protection zone and lowering of landing height. There's all a runway extension. There's a previous meeting recording, but it also dances around the answer. I don't know, Sam or Bill, if you want to try to answer that.
I think he's talking about the difference between the zoning and then the glide slope into or out of the runway. So the zoning is more of a protection area around a runway that says, hey, we don't want certain things within this area because it's not compatible to have, a cell phone tower at the end of the runway. It's more of a what can you put in the zone. And then the other thing you're talking about here is landing height. So that's more of the glide slope or the approach into the runway. And those are different from each other. Those are not the same. The approach into a runway follows a slope or an imaginary surface, as we call it. But that would change slightly. But I believe we hit on earlier, that's more about the height of a particular building within that surface. So they are different, but they do work together. And hopefully that kind of answers your question. That's a fairly complicated question, so it's tough to kind of hit on here.
Great, thank you. Was there any consideration when proposing higher density campus housing in close proximity to the former Superfund site, the old landfill? And certainly we are aware that that site is along 421 in this area. We think that there's a separation that can be provided so that would not be a concern. Keep in mind those issues are the biggest concern when you are using water systems that are local wells or something in proximity to that, whereas any development that would happen in those areas would be off of public utilities. And that would take it away as well as any type of setbacks and spacing. We're not at that level of detail to figure out what that would be. So yes, that is known issue and would need to be considered as you get into the detailed plan of this. So the next question is, what is the plan to prevent development of properties south of the runway, which is zoned R3? And this has been one of the challenges. I think we mentioned earlier that land south of the runway was rezoned by the county before this was part of the town. As we look at this plan, if we were drawing an ideal map, we'd really say that land should stay undeveloped, but it is, and there's a right to develop that. So what we've looked at is there's a few options. And right now this plan concludes that the best thing is for no development, but it does not say how to prevent that. It identifies that you could look at trying to acquire that land. It looks that you could try to proactively rezone it, but this is going to take a lot of work in figuring out and working with the property owners and developers and others. This is just going to take time. It's a complicated issue. We acknowledge that, but we can hear from so many of the residents in the area that say, let's not develop more closer to the airport as well, and realize that this is something that needs to be considered. So there's not a specific plan, but there is a clear recommendation as to what to do. How does the area east of the airport tie in with Hamilton County's long-term planning? Have they developed similar plans on the Hamilton County side? The answer to that is I do not believe, and Bill may be able to answer this, but I do not believe they have any plans on the opposite side. So that would be a future consideration for the airport authority to look at that.
Yeah, there's no specific plans now. The objective is to try to do have the same kind of land use planning on the Hamilton County side of the line as on the Zionsville side of the line.
The next question is, how do we have a discussion on how you integrate something like the village district with existing housing in that area before a change in zoning occurs? Or small discussion sessions of potential? I think as you look at something like that village district, again, this is a land use plan, so it's a very high level, and there becomes a future phase where you look at really master planning that and starting to figure out how do you integrate a development with those areas around it. And whether that's driven by a town or whether that's driven by developers, those small discussions and those very focused conversations about how development like this impacts each individual property need to occur. But that's much further down the road because that's just not at this point yet. But it is going to be something that would be important as this is considered. Next question is, how does this affect our property taxes if land is rezoned? And that's kind of a broad question, and maybe if provide a little bit more detail as to what specifically you're looking for. Some it would benefit the property. If you're talking about land that's just zoned for agriculture and you start to look at it as a higher use, land values could go up considerably. But there's scenarios where the opposite case could occur as well. So it really depends on the individual property that is there. If you're planning to prevent development on property near the airport, is there a plan to condemn those properties or otherwise compensate landowners? There is no plan to condemn any property as part of this. As I said, I think one of the challenges is areas south of 200. How do you make that decision? I think I just covered that question. That it's going to have to be some conversation about how that happens. So if we are north of 200, could we resell our home and property in the same zoning, currently agriculture? And would that go to the new zoning, forcing us to sell as commercial? I guess I'm not following the question entirely. Let me reread this. I think that this is not an issue, and maybe somebody else is reading this different than I am, but if you're north of 200, this does not, those areas are really intended to be mostly open space in those areas. If it's up closer to where that district is, anything related to that airport village district is very long-term. And so we'd have to get into specific sites and to answer that in more detail. I'm going to try to go to a couple more questions that we have with hands up, and I think a few of these I've heard from before. So Beth Kramer, I have a question from you. Get your hand up.
You called on me already, so.
Okay, maybe I just didn't dismiss it right. Okay, thank you.
I mean, I'm happy to keep talking.
I'm going to move on. We've got a few more questions to answer still. Thank you.
For what it's worth, just the way I read the last question, and I can't speak for someone because I don't know who did that question, but I think what they're asking is right now their home is zoned agricultural, but if they want to sell, and now if you change the zoning to light industrial, I think their question was now they're selling a commercial property land use, that's how it's zoned. So I think that's what they were asking. And I think, yes, if the zoning's changed, then their nice rural farm is now zoned as light industry, which
I appreciate the clarification. I think the issue with that, maybe to answer that specific question, is that if you just sell your land and it stays the same use, you're not changing the use. It becomes when you have your farm and you want to rezone it and you want to change it to something different than is on the future land use map, that's when it starts to become a challenge. Those issues go into effect, but land can continue to be a farm. As long as it's not changed, that would continue on. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you.
I have Tyson, and a couple of these I may have not lowered. So Tyson?
You have gotten me already as well.
All right, thank you so much.
Certainly.
Bruce, I know we talked earlier. Did you have anything else that you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, first before I forget, I wanted to thank all of you people for answering our questions. I think we appreciate you giving us this opportunity. I did want to ask a question of, I believe it was Sam that said they are receiving $3 million in federal funding. Could you possibly on the Zionsville provide a written summary of the specific funding that you're receiving from the FAA and for what portions of your runway expansions? that you are funded at currently, what you anticipate coming in as, I don't know how it works, as things are completed. And I think for those of us who are adamantly opposed to this proposal, I think we would like to know how many federal tax dollars are being essentially funneled to what is a airport that's primarily used by executives and corporates, right? And small private individuals with small planes. I think we would like to know that the specifics of the funding that you're receiving. So if we want to, if we feel like the Zionsville Town Council is not listening to us, we can pursue action at a state level or a federal level, either through our senators or House of Representatives, to try to get funding pulled if we want. But we would like to see, I would like to see a breakdown of the specific funding that you are receiving, because as I think, I'm sorry, I forgot her name, but the gal mentioned you can get up to 150,000 a year, and I think you can accumulate 5 years in a row for 750,000 of federal dollars, and you mentioned a $3 million figure. So I'm confused, and I would like that presented to the people that are considering this, what's going on.
Make a quick comment, Sam.
Go for it.
Well, there's two types of funding, as we mentioned. The $150,000 is what's called discretionary funding, and every airport gets that. There's other fundings that airports have to compete for based upon submittal of a proposal to the FAA. Now, the reason that our airport or Indy Exec is funded by the FAA right now is it's listed as a national airport and also as a reliever airport for Indianapolis International. The FAA established reliever airports several years ago to divert business jet traffic and small traffic away from large commercial airports because of the interference with jet traffic there. So the reason we're funded the way we are by the FAA is because we've been established as a reliever airport and are listed as a national airport based upon traffic patterns.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. And just to kind of add on to that, so national airport is the highest ranking a general aviation airport can get from the FAA. But even if we weren't a nationally ranked airport, there are hundreds and hundreds of airports out there, general aviation airports, that are funded by the FAA, regardless of size. You can go online and look up the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems. And there is a massive list of essentially every airport in the country that receives federal funding, and there are a lot of them. So it's not just us. It's not we're not just taking federal money and we're the only ones. Pretty much any airport you see that's larger than a grass strip is taking some kind of federal funding. So it's a massive system. I can tell you're familiar with the AIP program. You've probably done some research into there. So I don't know, and someone can kind of step in here and pipe in, but I don't know if there's a way to see the AIP funding anywhere online. I'm not sure if the FAA shares a list of that anywhere.
They do publish it.
Okay, great. So yeah, there's a published list of AIP programs. So I don't have a link to that, but I'm sure with a quick Google search, you should be able to find the information about the funding and by what year and what airport that you're looking for.
I just comment, Sam, as you just said, there's over 3,000 airports that are a part of the National Plan of Integrated Airport System, or NIPIS as we call it. And, trying to pinpoint exactly what the funding levels are going to be, they're somewhat of a moving target. They're decided on an annual basis. So, they're coming from the airport improvement program, which is generated through aviation related tax dollars. So this isn't something that's, funding the airport. That means we're taking money away from roads or something else. This is generated by aviation related activity and the taxes for that. So it's a very specific trust fund that is dedicated to provide those federal dollars that would go into the airport runway project.
I would also say that the FAA isn't going to fund an airport unless they believe that it's worthy of funding.
Very good. I've got a couple more questions. So I've got Fabian. I've got you up. Fabian, you'll have to unmute yourself if you want to speak. All right, I'm going to disable that, but if you raise your hand again, we'll get you back on. Craig, I have you up. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you again for answering my first question. I just wanted to clarify again, I am very, very close to what's happening right now at the airport. And I'm in what you would call the future reuse area. I just want to be clear that if for some reason we get rezoned and our land gets designated for a different use, that there's no chance of a forced sale by us to either a public or a private entity or eminent domain. Is that correct?
So there's a lot of complications there and a lot of hypotheticals about what could happen in the future. And I'm not going to speak to hypotheticals. A forced rezone is a tricky animal, and that would only occur through a very public process, and that is steps down the road. And that's, I don't think, what we're looking at as part of this. So that's not really the intent of what we're looking at here is forcing somebody out by any means. And so I don't know if there's a better way to answer that, Stephanie. I'm coming up with the wrong words right now.
Yeah, that's not very reassuring right now. And the reason why is we also have a future that we have to plan for. And we have to know whether we invest in our own property, whether it's worth it. We have to look at our ROI on anything that we might spend on our home. I was thinking about building actually a new outdoor facility for some of my equipment, and I put that on hold because of this. And so I kind of need some answers and some reassurance that I'm not going to be forced to sell my property or somebody's going to take it through eminent domain.
That's not the intent of anything that we're talking about here, period.
No, I think, Craig, if we could try to ease your mind a little bit, a land use plan like this is really, step one. It's to identify where are these types of uses so that moving forward, we can make better decisions. From an existing property owner perspective, I would say, our encouragement would be to continue to live your life and do what you need to do and want to do with your property under your existing zoning. If anything comes from the land use plan beyond it being a guidance document, and we've mentioned, if it moved to the next phase where it became something legislatively driven, where we do develop an overlay zoning, which we don't know that that's going to be where the plan will go. That's, that's the next step down the road if the town elects to move that way. At that point, I don't believe in any of the conversations that we've been a part of, there's any intention to come in and forcibly take anybody's property for a rezoning. This is much more of a cooperative approach, if you will, that we want to make good neighbors for you so that you're not adversely impacted by the airport and the activity that's happening there. And then conversely, the same thing that, for any development that's happening around the airport, for it to not have severe repercussions to the infrastructure that's already at the airport or any future development. So it's, as Corey said, it's kind of a delicate balance. Could we sit here today and say nobody's ever going to come to your door and knock and ask to buy your property for something related to the airport or something else? I don't think any of us sitting here today have the power to make that kind of an affirmation to you. However, I think we could clearly say that that is not any intent of the strategic plan at this point in time with what would typically come from a strategic planning effort like this.
I don't mind somebody asking. I just don't want somebody telling me. How about that?
I completely understand.
We're all feeling the same way about that one.
Well, and I can offer that forcing the sale of land there's very specific tools that government is severely limited to use that type of mechanism. And it's generally focused on providing for infrastructure such as roads, sewer lines, municipal support. Again, back to infrastructure, acquiring land for economic development purposes forcefully is simply not something I believe is supported by any stretch of the imagination, even by law.
Okay, thank you.
And Corey, I just want to jump in real fast. We're gonna lose Bill here at 8 o'clock. So I know we still have a number of Q&A questions. Maybe we can kind of start knocking some of these out before we lose Bill.
Yeah, absolutely. We can do that and push through a few of these. And we'll try to get through several of these quick because we've already been going for a little while now. So I appreciate everybody. There's still many folks on here, so thanks. So we'll try to answer these quickly and swiftly. Where would the commercial demand for at 32 and 421 come to, since there's not a lot of rooftops in that area right now? I just have to point this as such a long-term nature of the plan. These are two major highways and an intersection of two major highways at some point will warrant commercial development. It's not today, but at some point in the future. And a land use plan like this has to look 20, 30 plus years into the future and say what might be needed and how do we allocate that. So today it makes no sense. Long term, we want to make sure that there's some flexibility long term. Question about what the town is hearing from the community. Of course, biased, but I have not heard from any other community member who is happy or supportive of expanded use of the airport. I guess one of the first things I would say is this is not a plan to expand the use of the airport. We know the airport runway is happening, and that's really separate from this plan. What we want to do is make the best land use decisions around that. So certainly warrant those questions. I don't know, Wayne, if there's anything else you want to add to that since your name was on this question.
No, I have nothing specific to add.
Okay. The next question asks, do we have a map showing 1 nautical mile south of the runway extension? Stephanie, have we produced a map like that?
Yes, I do here. That's it. The shaded area. It's in the presentation that we gave on the runway extension.
Great.
So it covers a good chunk of the Brookhaven Fieldstone and parts of the building.
Why should infrastructure investments be made in this area before build out of Creekside? I think we answered this question earlier, and so I'm not going to kind of go back through that. The answer is this is not about infrastructure investments. This is land use. You mentioned ideas around light manufacturing. I think we answered this one. Are we trying to increase daily flights? There's not a daily limit of flights, but there's not a goal to increase traffic either. There may be economic benefits to airport. How can we educate our community about the benefits of the airport? For example, number of jobs created, educational opportunities, and high-tech businesses. I think one of the things is this plan comes out, we're going to include a little bit of that information in there, and then it's continued operations and continue having these conversations. Certainly by having a couple open houses, we've talked a lot about this, and it's going to have to be a topic that continues. Anything else to add?
Corey, I just add to that the INDOT Office of Aeronautics is currently starting their statewide system plan, and they're updated their economic impact study. And so probably within the next, hopefully 18 to 24 months, they will have a new economic impact study that will look specifically at every public use airport in the state. So there will be some new numbers that would be generated for what's happening at the airport today.
Thank you.
At the webinar we did for the runway extension, we went over those numbers, so you can find it there.
Are there developers already interested in purchasing property considering zone for residential? I assume this is a question about the area directly south of the runway. I believe that several developers have expressed interest in that, but nothing has moved forward at this point on that project. Last meeting guaranteed there would not be cargo, and yet light industrial would ship out, and that's cargo. I guess it depends on bulk of cargo is really the key question. I think we kind of talked about this, figuring this question was asked an hour ago. I think we've covered it. We've gotten through the hands up questions a little quicker than the ones on here. So the next question, 32 and 421 is in the Estate Conservation District. However, a little after that, that part of it would be for light commercial airport village. There was opposition to development of Wolf Run course. Could you address that specifically? Areas west of 421 in this plan were recommended to remain as a the estate residential uses. The area at the southeast corner of that intersection was identified as an appropriate place for long-term commercial investment. We're certainly looking for input on this, and that's why we're out here, because we know that issue came up before. And we want to make sure this is the appropriate balance. The character west and east of 421 is a very different area. West of 421, it's a lot of rolling hillsides and wooded areas, topography. East, it's a lot more flat and a lot more open. So very different areas, and we want to make sure that this is appropriate for that. So we'll take, certainly open to other comments. Second, Beth Kramer's comments. We like our home. Thank you for that input. Next question. This manufacturing and shipping would not require larger planes. The airport is limited on the size of plane that can take off and land there right now based on the design of the runway, the weight bearing capacity. There are zero plans to change the load bearing capacity of the runway to allow larger planes. So one of the common questions we've had is, hey, we're going to get big jets coming in here. And the answer is no, the runway cannot support those. The length doesn't matter. It's really the thickness of the pavement. You say light commercial to the east of the airport and the village just provides the opportunity to community. What is the opportunity for the city? I think the question is, where do you need commercial long-term? And that's ultimately the question, is where in this area is it appropriate for commercial? And most of it is, the answer would be absolutely, doesn't seem like commercial is appropriate in a lot of places. This would be the one place, because of the two highways, where it would be viable and appropriate in the long term, potentially. But that's what we want to seek input on as part of this. So I think that's a good question and a good point. I think we've answered this about biotech and may not be viable. We appreciate that input. How do we rationalize the proposed mixed density residential transition district in the area in close proximity to the Superfund? I think we've answered that question. I don't believe the town should change zoning in this area at all. It goes against the reason people live in the area. It doesn't fit. Mix. Thank you. Again, if it's statements, we've got that recorded for the record. Will you take into account that the county proposed to rezone this? Yes, that will be taken into account. We're opposed to leapfrog development and opposed to sewer near the airport. Okay. And again, I don't want to dismiss all these. We have them recorded. I live in the employer zone land. How can that be? Who supports this but a few of you on the call? Appreciate the input. We'll take that into consideration as part of this. And this is not the last time for input on this plan. This is before there's even been a draft document developed, so it's still very early. Were other jurisdictions consulted when developing the plan zoning for this area? This is in Zionsville's jurisdiction, so this has been mostly a plan for Zionsville's, it's within their jurisdiction. So we have not reached out to those other communities for their input on this. The airport, though, it has to work with both. So I know they have had conversations with that separately. I don't know if there's anything that we need to speak to specifically about conversations with other entities.
Yeah, we'll be taking a closer look at some of the Hamilton County townships and areas to the east of us in a future land use study.
If the town is pursuing these land use changes, have you approached NDOT regarding expansion or improvements to 421? That question came up earlier and we answered it. strongly suggest you revisit no plans for noise mitigation. Understood. That question came up earlier. I agree with comments regarding not changing the current zoning. That's why people live here. Thank you so much for your input on that. There's significant demand for residential development in Union Township. It seems that with the airport and the landfill and significant amount of estate home sites, that almost all the residential development should go north of State Road 32 and west of 421. How's this area going to be served with utilities? Have you had discussions with Trico Utilities for sanitary, and when will that happen? I think that the challenge that we're looking at with this, so two things. Trico serves up to 200. North of that, it's actually an HSE Utilities jurisdiction. HSE Utilities does not have any infrastructure out here. And so any development really north of 200 at all is outside the jurisdiction of Trico. So they won't have any influence on that. The challenge with developing only north of State Road 32 is it kind of falls against the town's policy so far, which have been to discourage leapfrog development. Going that far north seems to be quite a stretch from the town's development policies to date. But it's one of those things that certainly needs to be considered as the area around the airport, making those decisions here. Crash course in history of the airport for Zionsville for residents that don't understand its growth timeline, why it's located in Zionsville and owned by Hamilton County. It's confusing. Boy, that's a great question for somebody who's just coming into this and sat through 2 hours of this conversation and wondering why Hamilton County is involved in this.
The question was asked briefly, and the answer to briefly is no. However, if you go to the Zionsville site and look at the recording from the webinar that we did regarding the airport extension, we did cover that fairly well, I think.
Yeah, no short answer to that one. When it's time for the airport village to be developed, will there be discussion with current residents of that property, or will be? Certainly there will be conversations. That's a long time into the future in all likelihood. But that would take, because there's no sewer, and that's why I say it's a long-term issue. That's going to take involvement with residents, and residents would make the decision to sell land to develop that out, and would be part of a rezoning effort as well. So there's plenty of additional opportunities to provide input there. We've got 2 more questions and 1 hand up, and we certainly can take any more. 3 more questions. Isn't it misleading to imply the airport runway extension is happening? The airport probably has considerable freedom with regards to construction on its property. However, incompatible land use in close proximity could well limit the airport's ability to use that extension for landing purposes. Stephanie, do you want to help with that?
Well, I think as was discussed pretty extensively in the runway webinar, so I'd encourage you to go take a look at that. You know, the FAA has already approved the environmental document and for the airport to move forward. And so if they felt that there were compelling and compatible land uses related that would be a problem, they would not have approved that document and would not be allowing the airport runway extension to be moving forward. Jumping forward here to our current project, I guess, you know, that's a big part of the reason for addressing that now is so that we can try to keep from having additional incompatible land uses. More importantly, for the local community to make sure that we can try to have a more harmonious relationship between the two, but also protect that investment. So it is very much a equal relationship there where that we're trying to make sure that we're addressing quality of life issues for everybody around the airport, and also make sure that that investment that's being has previously been put in as well as moving forward is going to be able to be realized.
Thank you. We are in employers owned land and do not support this plan. Assuming that tax rates would increase substantially with the zoning change. Again, this is a land use plan. This is not a change in zoning. So take the comment and appreciate it. Just recognize that this is not a rezoning proposal. Approving this plan does not change how you use your property. That is a future issue. This is a guide to provide direction on that. The last question I have, and then we'll go to the hand up, Chad. Can you provide a link to the attendees to the previously mentioned Q&A documents for airport expansion? If you go to the town's website, the Indianapolis Executive Airport Study provides that. And so I'm going to put that up on screen real quick for anybody that has that. So I provided earlier.
If they just go to the Zionsville site and in the search bar, just type airport, they'll get to it.
Yeah, so if it's under just, and you can just Google Zionsville Indianapolis Airport Study and it will come up as well. All right, we've got one last question from Chad. I'm going to put you up, Chad. I appreciate you waiting this long to talk, but you're up.
Yeah, no, I guess I just wanted to make my comment for the record in the sense that I live north of 200 South in the airport area, and this project doesn't make any sense to me that you would want to put commercial next to the airport unless you had the pure intentions just to push more traffic through the airport, which that's the purpose of the extension, is for more flight. So, you know, I guess I find it a little disingenuous in some of the commentary here of about what those uses and purposes are. And I guess I would just want to say that, you know, the same comments that I called into the call about the extension of the airstrip last month, and the common comment was, well, it was approved in the land plan. And so basically, if this gets approved, it's going to go that direction. And so just for everybody out there's sake, you know, if you don't want this to happen, this is the time to stop it. Because if this gets through, it's a done deal. And I do appreciate you hosting the call and taking our input. That's all I have.
Well, I guess I just thank you, Chad. Thank you so much for your comments, and thank you so much for everyone who has participated in this tonight.
I want to make one comment about what Chad just said. I think he may be mentioning the master plan for the airport, as opposed to that's what he's saying was approved. I mean, that has been approved by the FAA and so forth, but the runway extension has no, this land use study has no bearing on what goes on at the airport.
Thank you. Well, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. We really have appreciated it. You've been a good group, and everybody just, I think that even though these are sensitive topics, and certainly this impacts many people's property, as several of you have expressed. So we appreciate how you handled yourself tonight, asking good questions and making your opinions clear and so respectful as well. So thank you. And next steps in this, we'll be working to put out a rough draft, taking into account what we've heard tonight. So that really becomes where we're going with this. Is there anything else before we wrap up? Thank you so much for everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.